This video will explain how I make the mast connections for my DIY hydrofoils. First, drill two 19mm diameter holes into the fuselage where the two bolts from the mast will go through. Then, tape one side and fill the holes with high density filler mixed with epoxy. This will create a solid barrier between the bolts and the plywood. It will also allow the bolts to be screwed on tight without any risk of crushing the wood. Next, drill the holes for the bolts. Starting with a small bit and working your way up will help with accuracy. Make the holes 1mm wider than the mast bolt diameter in order to have some wiggle room for adjustments later. Trace the mast profile onto the plywood blank and use a router to cut out a hole 4mm wider than the mast profile and around 14mm deep. Then insert the bolts into the holes and place 2 layers of carbon fiber cloth into the cavity. The carbon fibers can be spread out to let the bolts through. Make sure the layers of carbon cover all surfaces inside the cavity. Add some sort of release agent to the bolt threads to prevent sticking. I personally use Crisco butter, but anything greasy should work. Just be careful not to get the grease anywhere else but the bolts. Protect the mast base with saran wrap or a good release agent and bolt the hydrofoil into the mast. But not all the way tight, you'll need some wiggle room, and make sure the carbon is properly placed around the mast. Place the foil on a perfectly flat surface and level the fuselage. Pour epoxy into the cavity from the sides until it is filled. You can lift the mast up a little bit to allow the epoxy to fill the bottom of the cavity. Adjust the mast until it is perfectly vertical using a bubble level. I use broomsticks taped to the top of the mast to hold the mast in place. After that, I like to add a little bit of high density filler on top to have extra material for shaping purposes. I also use wood screws to align the leading edge and trailing edge of the mast to the center of the fuselage. Once the epoxy has cured, remove the wood screws and the bolts and slide the mast out of the fuselage. The mast should fit perfectly into the hydrofoil and result in a solid connection. After this, just sand down the excess epoxy and fibers from the top of the foil and keep shaping your blank. So that's it. The ability to connect anything you want to your mast unlocks the infinite world of DIY foil designs.